Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar is on trauma-informed care and PBIS. Kat Rollerson will be our main presenter today.
My name is Kat, and I work with a lot of the districts up here in the northeast corner of the state. When the word trauma comes up, people think of all kinds of things. So there's some really important pieces of the definition that's up there from SAMHSA on this slide. One of the biggest pieces that you see, if it stands out, let's see if I can get my fancy arrow here. I guess I cannot. But the two pieces that really stand out is the word experiences. So trauma is about the perception of an experience, and then it gives some more information for you about that experience is causing a reaction that's intense, and it'll go across several domains, but primarily that physical and psychological stress is the main piece of that reaction of experience. So it's not a specific thing or a specific event or one example, but rather the experience of an event that causes those intense reactions. And so people can experience the same event in different ways. So that experience part of the definition is really important. We'll talk a little bit about why people have different reactions to traumatic events. And then that perception that it's very harmful to them or threatening. We'll also talk a little bit about what that means for intervening on it. And then that long-lasting effect of it. We'll talk a little bit more, we'll unpack that a little bit as far as what kind of reactions you will see from a traumatic experience. All in the lens today of being aware of that, and then how that impacts practices we can do to support what we call resiliency to overcome some of those experiences. The other kind of glaring piece out there right now in the field is the prevalence of this. So here from SAMHSA, you can see the prevalence that research has found over 50% of our general population has had at least one traumatic experience based on that definition above. So that was a very in your face to me, very prevalent piece of how common trauma exposure is. And if that piece isn't enough, this is an example from Washington State, and I'll briefly talk about if you haven't heard of the ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. Again, you could probably do a half-day talk on that study itself, but the original one came out of the CDC and was around 1997. But since then, there's been a lot of replications of that study looking at different populations. So that original study was general population in our adults, looking at what kind of adverse child experiences they had exposure to. And since then, that's been replicated in several groups. For example, our DJJ in Florida has replicated that study, looking at the population that are in some of those centers or settings. And this example in front of you just gives that glimpse at a classroom prevalence level, and that's why we pulled this one out specifically today. But in Washington State, the research they found and looking at that exposure to ACEs, 13 out of every 30 students in a classroom. So when you think of your districts and your classrooms, that prevalence is pretty high. And not just the piece of they've had exposure to those events, but you see that piece about 3 or more, and I'm just gonna, put my red box up there. In particular, looking at the number of kids in a classroom who had 3 or more of those adverse childhood experiences. And we know from the ACEs study that the more experiences we've had in adverse childhood events, the more likelihood that we have to be at risk for things like chronic health issues, social emotional dysfunction, all the way to early death because of some of those risk factors. And that's what that study truly tried to explore and link to, was what kinds of adverse child experiences linked to that risk. But again, just to give you an idea of not only the definition, but the prevalence, we mentioned the general prevalence in the last slide, and here looking at specifically a classroom setting and what those are. Some examples of adverse childhood events, things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, divorce, moving, chronic moves, looking at substance abuse in the home, untreated mental health issues in the home. Those are all examples of things that we look at in adverse childhood events. So we talked about the definition and we talked about the prevalence because those are some of the glaring things, is that astounding prevalence out there. So then we think of the impact, and that's the area where I was telling you the awareness of the impact of trauma and what it can look like is we could talk for days probably about it. So we're going to give you a brief snippet of that today. With that alignment again, that we're always looking at a piece of trauma-informed care is to build awareness of that connection of what trauma and those adverse childhood experiences, or the term you'll hear a lot is toxic stress experience, what that can look like. So as I go through this slide, again from SAMHSA, a nice summary of some of these points. If you think of yourselves right now and anytime you've been really stressed or really scared, and think about how that felt and how that impacted you, you'll get a little closer connection to what some of the impact has been. The biggest pieces that we see impact in is that regulating of emotion. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the piece of that, that flight or fight symptom. I always give the analogy of I am terrified of snakes. So when I see snakes, I'm either going to stop because I'm so terrified I can't move, or I'm going to run because I don't want to be anywhere near that snake. While I give a funny example, that is the real life experience of someone who's been through a traumatic experience, and we know it has that impact to cause this fight or flight feeling like that of a snake all the time. And there's a lot of interesting research on the specific impact on the brain, but to summarize that nicely, a lot of the areas of the brain that help us regulate emotions are highly impacted because they get so much work if we're in settings where we're getting chronic stress or getting lots of exposure to trauma. At the same time, we'll talk in a minute about learning impacts. Some of the areas of our brain that help us with learning and memory are often impacted in a negative light for those that experience chronic stress or excessive exposure to trauma. So big pieces here: self-regulation, how we regulate our emotions, and that executive function piece, focus, staying focused on a longer task, planning ahead. And I asked you to think about yourselves when you're stressed or super stressed or afraid of something, and you kind of get that feeling of it's hard to focus. You may be a little bit irritable or overreact in those cases. Very similar type of response, but here you're looking at someone's cases who have been exposed repetitively or have a lot of risk factors that have caused these to become more stable traits in response to trauma. So I'll quickly reference this one in terms of, and I mentioned there's no one typical response to trauma, and it's going to vary based on several factors. This is a really nice summary from Helping Traumatized Children Learn, and the link is there for you in the slides, out of Massachusetts. They've done a lot of work along with the Washington State that was mentioned on what this looks like in schools and policy in alignment with that. Quickly to summarize some of the black boxes that you see up there, those are the big features of what will cause reactions to vary to trauma. So characteristics within an individual, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then the environment that the students are in and how that would impact their response to trauma, and then also the characteristics of the event itself. So I keep mentioning the piece of it's very different about a one-time exposure in some cases versus I'm exposed to a traumatic event and I'm still exposed to that traumatic event, like something like physical abuse or being in a home where someone is exposing them to verbal abuse or neglect. So the three boxes are your big filters. Those are the characteristics, and then there's a list underneath those for some of those features. But reactions are definitely going to vary. Within the individual, we know age, of course, is going to play a way there, and then where they are in development. So in terms of language development, understanding perspectives of other people, cognitive development, that's going to be a big piece. So I give you that quick snapshot because it's a nice summary to me. You have the link there, but the box gives a nice summary of some of those features within those three areas that will cause reactions to vary. On a similar note, though, some common themes and reactions, and we always talk about them in different domains. So what are those emotional characteristics, those physical characteristics, cognition impacts, behavior, and then those things that we start to think about after the event. So when you look at the different domains, you can see some examples of that. I mentioned emotional regulation first because it's going to be one we talk about a lot in terms of what we can do to prevent any risk factors that come with traumatic exposure. But when you think of your school-wide PBIS system and what you teach in desired behaviors, a lot of times, and we'll make some connections to that directly, there'll be the inverse of these things. So instead of anger, we're using safe behaviors that involve anger management, for example. But a lot of our practices around teaching those behaviors are mutually beneficial here when we talk about a trauma-informed care approach because of some of the symptoms you see there. Okay, and then I mentioned learning, especially because I know you're all in schools and school districts where put to the forefront always is academics. And so what is the outcomes we're seeing in terms of acquiring learning? And one important piece that we talk a lot with districts doing a lot of this work is the idea that if we know this type of exposure, it directly impacts, I mentioned some of the brain research, but it directly impacts students' ability to acquire learning. And there's some specific bullets there to what that looks like in terms of that impact. But when we're gaining buy-in or talking about why it's important to focus on social emotional competencies, for example, this is one of my favorites because that impact, that direct piece to how it impairs the ability to learn is a really big piece for our schools and districts that are looking at that as our priority area. So when we looked at some of those historical risks and what happened to help them become competent adults despite those adverse circumstances, we now know a lot about how we foster those protective factors in children as well as in their environments. We also know that to offset that risk, one of those important environments is schools. So one, we can impact a lot of that risk, even prevent some of that risk by looking at what we know are protective factors. And then, which a lot of those examples you just listed in the chat box would match that. And then we know schools are one of the most ideal settings to where we can teach these skills and also create those environments that foster some of those protective factors. So the gist, we know from research that we know what these characteristics are that promote protective factors and resiliency, and a lot of them are ones that we can impact.
Here, these are examples of different kinds of responses that can cause re-traumatization in our students. So things like isolating students, restraining students, minimizing or ignoring student responses, allowing abusive behavior to continue, inconsistently enforcing rules, and applying rigid policies without an opportunity to question them. Think about these types of responses and how these responses relate to what your school does with your discipline process. How often do you use seclusion or restraint with students? How often are rules enforced consistently versus inconsistently? How often are we giving students a voice in the disciplinary event that involves them? So these are types of responses that we would want to minimize if our school is going to take a trauma-informed approach to providing their multi-tiered behavior framework.
And then last but not least, one piece of this approach that we sometimes forget about, but it has become, to me, really been brought to the forefront lately about staff self-care, or what we call compassion fatigue. You, I'm sure, on this call are all educators, so we are all very familiar with the concept of compassion fatigue. But looking at that support piece for not re-traumatizing with adults, because a lot of your adults may have had traumatic exposure or may be in working environments that are promoting that chronic toxic stress.